Welcome back to our videos about server-side JavaScript development. In this video we're going to talk about controllers and models, which are two of the components of our example applications. Firstly, I want to talk to you about Express. We have already seen what request handlers are, so if you're not familiar with them, please go back to the previous videos. Express, in short, allows you to react to incoming requests and send responses. It's possible to extend Express by putting some layers between the incoming request and the final function which is going to be executed to produce a response. These layers can, for example, distinguish between a user which has authentication and a user that has not, so that the final response is different for someone that is authenticated and different for someone who's not. Express can also be extended using other packages, but for our simple applications we didn't need to use them, so we're not going to discuss about these. If you'd like to know more about these, please go on the web, there's plenty of guides to find out more about this. In our API example, you will find Express in the files that are highlighted on the left side. You will find also Express in the same files on the complete example, but for the reference of these two components and what we're going to discuss in this video, we use the API. You will find Express starting in the index.js, and that's the first file we're going to look at. So in the index.js, we define Express. We actually have to require it. So the first thing that we do is we require Express, and we define it as a constant variable because it won't change during the execution of our code. The second thing that we do is we define our application, which is app, and it's an Express application, so we define it as an Express app. With Express, we can set values. And specifically in the third line of code, which will be compiled, we will see that you can define the port number on which our application is going to be listening, and this port number is by default going to be 3000. Later we see that we can define a router, which is the logic that stands behind knowing which requests are coming in and what output or response to produce. In the last lines of code, what we see is that we actually listen to incoming requests. And we do so by listening on the port that we defined earlier. We also have a function which is a callback, and this function tells us that our Express server is listening on the port that we defined earlier. The other file that we want to look at for Express is our router.js and the controllers/relationship.js in our app folder. In the router, we define that if a GET request is coming at /API/relationships, the relationships controller has to perform a function which is relationships. This function is defined as below. So relationships is a function which accepts a request, an incoming request, and has as a second object the response, the outgoing response. What we do is we find objects in the relationships model, which we're going to explain shortly, so don't worry. If the find is successful, we will return the results of the find in the last meaningful line of code of this example, which is response.status200.sendResults. Notice that status200 in HTTP protocol, status 200 means that the request was answered successfully, that there was no problem, and that we are answering back, okay, we have the data. On the other hand, if there was an error, we are sending a status 500, which in HTTP means that there was an error, and that we are sending back an error object as well. The next thing that we will look at is MongoDB. We have already discussed about databases before, but specifically we will use MongoDB in our example. As I already said, MongoDB is a document-oriented database management system, and it's non-relational, which brings us to the most important part of non-relational database management systems, which is they don't have a schema. A schema allows you to say that whenever you have an object from a database, it will always have the same look and feel, to so say. Specifically, if we have a relational database system, we always know that we are going to find the same fields when we ask for the same data. So if, for example, I have an object which contains my name and my age, and I have a schema which defines that there's always the need of my name, my surname, and my age, all objects will always look like this. They cannot differ. On the other hand, in MongoDB, objects can differ. They can have more fields. For example, there could be name, age, and location from where I come from. Or they can be less fields. There could be only the name without a surname because someone forgot to put it in, and the age. MongoDB actually stores objects in a binary JSON format. It does so because binary JSON allows it to store not only the usual JSON files, but it also allows it to store music and images. This is the example of a JSON file being stored into a MongoDB entry. On the top we see an ordinary JSON file, and on the bottom we see what we would see if we insert this JSON file into MongoDB. As you see, MongoDB will give an attribute to the object which is _ID. This is very important because you will need an identifier in the object to know that this is the only object of its kind. If, for example, we have two people which have exactly the same name, surname, and are of the same age, then we would not know which objects we actually want to get. But thanks to the ID, which is a randomly generated information, we always have just one field which is for that specific object. The other fields which you see on the bottom are the same fields that we have already seen above, which are the name, the surname, and the age. To actually use MongoDB in a Node application, you need something called a driver. The most common driver with Node.js is called Mongoose. Mongoose allows you firstly to connect to the database and handle connection events. The second important thing is that it allows you to define models. Models allow you to enforce some type of a schema, which is the thing that we have discussed before. So through Mongoose, you could define that your objects always have to have the same structure, and that Mongoose won't accept objects if they're not of the structure that you have defined them in. The other thing that Mongoose allows you to do is to perform queries. So you can find objects, create objects, update and remove items. Let's see some code examples. First, we will find Mongoose in these files. As you see, there is one file which is highlighted a little bit differently than the other ones. This is because we are not directly using Mongoose, but we are using the Mongoose model created in the relationships model in the controller, so to produce a meaningful response when an incoming request is coming. Let's look at the model for the relationships. Here we define the model of our relationships. Firstly, we require Mongoose, as we did with Express in our previous example. The second thing that we do is we define our relationships model. Here we have three fields which are compulsory, so they are always required. If you will try to create new objects which doesn't have one of these fields, it won't work. Mongoose will complain. The three fields that we are going to need in our objects are source, target, and weight. The first two, source and target, are of type string, while weight is a number typed object. The second location in which we find Mongoose is our relationships controller. Here we can find objects in our model as seen from the fourth line of code. So we have our relationships model and we perform a find without filtering for results. Filtering for results would be something like if I'm only interested in those objects in which the source is equal to, for example, me, I would put this as a filtering before I perform the find. You can look at how filtering is done in examples on the Mongoose website. Mongoose allows us to do also other things. It allows us to create objects, as already said before. So in this specific case, we are creating a new object which has as source me, as target you, and as weight 6. If the object was successfully created, we will return an anonymous callback function which will log the created object, as we see below here. The next thing that we can do in Mongoose is to find and remove objects. Be careful, we are only finding and removing one object. This is very important because you can easily remove many items from your database, and maybe it's not what you want to do. So you have to be very careful when you're coding these parts of your application. So here what we are doing is we are finding one object, which is the first object in which the source is me, and we are removing it. If the removal is successful, we will log into console the removed object. Another thing that we can do is update objects. Also here you have to pay attention because the update function out of the box will only update the first filtered item that it will find in the database. So in this case, the first time it will find an object which has a source me, it will update it and put or set the target as Toman. So if we only have one object, which is the one that we created 2 slides back, instead of having source me and target you, it would have source me and target Toman. The weight will always be the same. What we have seen now were 4 basic operations which are needed in every database. They are called the CRUD stack. They stand for create, read, update, and delete. We have also seen which function you can use to perform these operations, which are on the model the create function, on the model the find function, on the model the update function, and on the model the remove function. I urge you again to pay attention when you implement the update and remove function, because you can easily generate mistakes within your data. So we have seen 2 of the components of our example applications, and in the next video we're going to discuss the missing component, which is the view. We decided to split these 3 components into the first 2 and the last component, which are the views, because sometimes you don't need the last component, as already explained in previous videos.